Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome to the Humanities Festival this year Sergei Lebedev. Sergei Lebedev is one of the most prominent Russian writers of his generation, which means the generation of those born in the 1980s. His novels, 5 so far, have been translated in more than 20 languages, and they have received or have been shortlisted for a long, really long list of literary prizes, both in Russia and internationally, of which probably I will mention only one, that your third novel, People of August, was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. There are some books, by the way, I just want to mention this now, and if you're lucky enough, you can catch some of his books, and Sergei was so nice to offer to sign for those that would like after this talk is over. Okay, so shall I repeat that? There are books by Sergei that you can buy on our book table, and Sergei was kind enough to offer to sign for those of you that are interested. In March last year, Sergei issued an open letter condemning the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and he lives now in Potsdam, in Germany. I would like to start, Sergei, this conversation with something that I see as a red thread running through all your writings, and this is the issue of historic guilt and personal responsibility. Already your first novel, Предел забвения, or probably in English, On the Brink of Oblivion, right? Oblivion, was telling the story, not without autobiographical repercussions, I think, of a young man who, by chance, discovers that his grandfather was working for a forced labor camp in the Soviet Union. So the issue of does one bear the responsibility for the crimes that have been committed by previous generation in your country? Should one forget or should one forgive? These are questions that are very much prominent in your writing. Also the question of the genealogy of evil and how to cut the chain of this evil being reproduced. Your most recent novel, I have it here in Bulgarian, the language in which I read it, Debutant, or The Untraceable, is inspired, if this can be the right word, by the poisoning of the Skripals. And it tells the story of a guy who invented this special poison that no one can trace, and who, at the end, falls prey of this same poison. So my question would be, why this question, this topic, this theme, big theme of the genealogy of evil, of historic guilt and personal responsibility and moral choices, plays such a central role in your writing?
Thank you. First of all, I think it's a very personal issue. In my family archive, I have a photo made in July 1914, just a month before the shot in Sarajevo. Around 50 people are standing there. It's what you can call a big family. Males, females, military uniforms, civil suits, whatsoever. This is the family. And in the left angle, barely visible, is my 6-year-old grandma. She's really small. You really need to know that she is there to spot her. In 30 years, she will be the only person alive of the whole photo. Civil war, okay, First World War, Civil War, repression, Second World War. Everybody will be gone. And none of these lives will end, as we call, naturally. All these threads will be cut. So what I have instead of the family memory or family foundation is a total absence of anyone, except one last standing witness. And also it was some personal thing in other way. My parents were geologists, so I joined the family tradition, I went into geology. And in the middle of 90s, in the middle of the moment when we suspected that Russia is taking the different path, I went into the geological expeditions in the north of Russia. I quite naively thought that I will meet, pristine nature, virgin forests or whatsoever. But what I met instead was the remnants of the Gulag Empire. The camps, the barracks, the road, still there, still standing. And this was the moment when I understood that this past is here. Even though it's the 90s, this past is here, it's present, it's tangible, it's visible. But no one witnesses it. Because literally these places were abandoned and lost and open to the oblivion. And this, I think, was the starting point. It was something physical, because we used the same roads as the prisoners did. We worked in the same mine shafts as they did as a geologist. And by this repetition, by this, stepping in some other's tracks, you learn physically what the experience could be. And you feel that by the fact that you had seen this, you bear some responsibility.
And do you see in the recent history of Russia attempts to deal with this past? Were there openings in the more recent Russian history where the country or the society did an attempt to deal with this past?
I'm very skeptical in this way. Because, of course, it was the opening in the late 80s, early 90s. But this was a very specific type of opening, I would argue. This was the moment when already the Soviet government, the late Soviet government, Gorbachev government, admitted, yes, there are millions of victims in our beautiful country. And they were recognized as such, in legal terms, as victims. Then the Russian law on rehabilitation followed, so we have this legal victims. But what sort of a crime was committed against these victims? And here the picture starts to blur, because the whole variety of the Soviet crimes against its own people, international crimes, are described as the summary of misuse of juridical system. There is no definition of state crimes as such. And, to make it the thing worse, who are the perpetrators? Who did this? Who should be held responsible? This should have been the most important political question of transition from Soviet Union to Russia. This question was never raised in its entirety, integrity, and seriousness. Even the most liberal-minded people, like Memorial Society or academician Sakharov, argued strongly against all the possible measures of transitional justice. They said it would have been a witch hunt. And this was the only moment when, according to sociological data, the demand by the society was quite high. But the intellectual leaders of the society was too afraid to push in this direction. So we have the culture of commemoration of victims, but we do not have any culture of bringing those responsible to justice. And unfortunately, we can see how this vicious tendency or circle of impunity had followed. Okay, these were the Soviet crimes or the Stalinist crimes. Since 1994, with the first invasion in Chechnya, we had 2 wars which resulted in the destruction of the whole region, enormous human losses, around 1 million of displaced persons. These crimes were perfectly documented by the Human Rights Watch activists. There is no enigma, there is no need to go to the archives. But strangely enough, the Russian political opposition never raised this question as an integral question of opposing Putin's regime. The main issue is corruption, not the wars, not the real bloody crimes. And I think this thing is the very basement or it's not the basement, it's the major flaw of Russia's political culture on the oppositional side as well. We prefer to let the things go. And we never is able to take a high and very critical ethical stand against the government of the state.
This leads us to a question whether this failure or lack of desire at all to deal with the heavy past has something to do with the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and to the question that is always often actually phrased, put together as, is this Putin's war or Pushkin's war? In other words, do you think that there is a historical predetermination of this invasion?
Major question of our talk. Several answers overlapping. First of all, it was the systematic feature of Soviet political and cultural system to treat Ukrainian nationalism, as they called it, as a major threat to the existence and integrity of the Soviet Union. All this bizarre stuff which we now witnessing on the television, not now, since 2014, it was, and it is, what was written in Putin's KGB school books. It was what he was taught to think. And it was also embedded in numerous pieces of literature, art, cinema, you name it. And of course, the very susceptibility of the Russian population to this propaganda cannot be explained just by the fact that the television has a monopoly. This very basement of imperial cultural superiority and inferiority of Ukrainian culture, the very basement of idea that Ukrainians are the same folk as we and we can claim them, is embedded from 19th to through the 20th century. There is enormous guilt here on not reflecting on it. And I would risk to argue that the colonial/imperial nature of some of the Soviet crimes are the less researched part of the whole Soviet heritage. Not necessary to go really so far. We know the case of the place named Sandarmoh in northern Karelia. It was the execution ground during the period of the Great Terror, 1937. This is the place where are buried around 200, 300 most prominent members of Ukrainian cultural elite of 20s and 30s. And the problem is that this place clearly states where the victimhood goes. Victimhood goes to Ukraine. Because it's not the Russian writers buried somewhere in Ukraine, it's quite opposite. But to recognize this, to recognize the role, the abusive role, which Russian culture and Russian language played throughout the 20th century, is something very hard. Is it a Pushkin war or a Putin's war? It's both. Because when Russian troops are taking the territory, what they're doing, they are renaming the streets back. Like it's a time machine trying to erase the 30 years of Ukrainian history, and they are putting the same Pushkin monuments as the symbol of ownership, as the symbol of dominance. And it fits pretty well because it was Pushkin who, in his poem Poltava, introduced and I would say injected into the Russian culture the idea of ambivalent nature of the Ukrainian nation in relation to Russian nation. Ukrainian can be friends, but Ukrainians are prone to betrayal, and they can betray us. So, and I think it's one of the most important failures of us in the modern days, that we kept the sacred status of Pushkin writings or Tolstoy writings. It would have been extremely necessary to reflect on the colonial/imperial nature of these writings. It was never done. We spent 30 years really just for nothing. And now we are being punished for this because, again, the cultural expansion follows the militaristic expansion, exactly in the same of the pattern of the Soviet Union.
Do you hear many voices? Now you live abroad, you don't live in Russia. And there are two questions that are in a way related. One is about this outside Russia, so to say, the Russians that are now emigres in Europe. Do you hear similar statements like the ones that you are doing now? Because I don't hear them very often, maybe I'm missing something. There is often this question why there are no protests of Russians in front of the Russian embassies across Europe. Why do these outside Russians don't express, you know, this that you wrote in your open letter March last year? And then the other question is there anything that people in Russia, those that oppose the war, can do?
First of all, about those who left, those who are in Europe. I'm pretty much amazed because I thought that the open invasion will shake some structures of power and loyalty within the Russian culture. Some figures will, I don't know, lose significance. Some question will arise. First of all, self-criticism. Why we miss this? Because it's very clear, we can compare it to the military intelligence. There was no intelligence, there was no intel, there was no reflection on science and what was coming. And quite the opposite, the very rare voices who argued that something really sinister will arise were sidelined and criticized for being too much of a whistleblowers. I thought that the full-scale invasion will be the lesson. From my point of view, no. What I can see that, it's a Moscow which really moved somewhere to Europe, and people are now rebuilding and reconstructing the same type of relations, circles of influence and power, and they are really in a defense mode. They are well prepared to defend the Russian culture against all the criticism. And it's amazing because I would suppose that the most fearsome criticism should and could go from us. But it never happened. It never happened. Therefore, I would say that there is a still strange connection between the Putin state, which abuses the culture and uses it in a militaristic way, and the, let's say, liberal milieu, which is not able to understand how much this culture is complicit. Therefore, continuing this complicity, unfortunately. This is my very tough diagnosis, and I really don't know the way out.
Do you think that probably part of this intelligentsia that is now outside Russia, and there are also medias, Russian media that are working from Amsterdam or Riga before, etc., that are trying to influence Russians in Russia now, do you think that one explanation of what you just described could be that they have to find a language that will not be so radical, so to say, that will resonate somehow to those people that do not have the opportunity probably to leave, that probably do not support the regime but are afraid to be outspoken, but who do not want to be blamed for their silence.
You know, we spent many, many years pretending that we are trying to find such a language. Attempts failed even in far more favorable conditions. We can go back to the experience of the wars against Chechnya. In the 90s, okay, it was the Yeltsin era, the television was more or less free. It was possible to report, to name things as they are. There was no restrictions at all. And what? What sort of the language you would like to find to convince people who do not want to be convinced, who do not want to see their reality? And I would say the opposite, that now is the last chance to make really strong stand and statements. Because the general presumption is still that, I mean, there is something called Russia. Okay, Putin's regime abuses it, but there is something called Russia. There is no such thing.
What do you mean?
I will explain. I mean, theoretically, it's called a federation. It's not a federation, because there is no real power within the subjects of this federation who are really the objects of it. It's a strange conglomerate of nations, even tribes sometimes, small minorities, brought together by centuries of militaristic expansion, cultural and military violence. To transfer this into some democratic country is not an easy project or idea. But until the moment we will say, yes, it's not the more normal country as we know it, it's not the European Union, it's something which should be disassembled and then assembled again, if we even want this to be assembled again. We will be doomed to the repetition of the circles. You cannot rule, very symbolic, you cannot rule this conglomerate of oppressed societies with the democratic means. You cannot do this. And when now the liberal thinkers have a tendency to overlook the legacy and record of colonial violence, for example in Caucasus, they are just going in straight into the abyss. It's the only moment when we can really raise these questions. Otherwise, any sort of democratic reforms in imaginary Russia will result the same way as the Yeltsin's reforms resulted back then.
So, can you tell us what is your prediction for the future of Russia then? Let's say the desired one you just kind of sketched. In order to become democratic, if I could try to paraphrase, the country should be disassembled and then probably assembled again. But as writers often have kind of intuitions that scientists probably lack, what is your intuition? What is the future after this war eventually is over?
First of all, there is a trap linked to the word future. Because the current Russian political project is aimed actually to the past. This elevator goes not high, it goes straight into the cellar, probably to the cellar with the numbers 1937. The whole shining of the Soviet political project was because of the fact that it claimed to be the most modern project in the world, the representation of real modernity. What we see in Russia now, in every day, it sunk deeper, deeper and deeper into the past. In terms of ideology, and it's not only the Soviet past, it's even the imperial past with its own chauvinistic and racial tendencies. In terms of ideology, in terms of repressive practices, in terms of what is possible in the public sphere and conscience, it goes deeper, 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 deeper. We are on the way back to the Stalinist period, definitely. So it's not just the question of the future. It's the question how you will deal in an imaginative scenario with the country which really traveled back in time. I'm asking this question myself very frequently to different experts. How we will deal with the very big group of people who directly or indirectly were and are engaged in the war. Those who served on the front line, those who themselves killed Ukrainians, those members of their families, and those huge entourage of those who profited from the war. They will be around at least several million people of them. What sort of political force you will have to remove them from positions of power? Nobody can explain. And I would say that nobody even dare to think about this. What sort of a leverage you will have? But if they will not be removed, it will be the country where the veterans of this war will be popular heroes.
What will be the role of people like Navalny? Let's presume that he goes out of, in this scenario, out of prison. What would be his role?
I do not know, because my problem with Navalny, I mean, his personal bravery is one thing, but his intellectual thinking is another. Since 2014 until 2022, he barely mentioned the war in Ukraine at all. His main focus was corruption. He never made any serious political statements about ongoing war. And this is a very bad sign. I mean, he's a good populist, and he will adjust. Because I would say that it was really ethically required not to be silent about this. But he was afraid to lose even this small milieu he had. So I don't think that it's a question of Navalny or the likes of Navalny. It's the question of if we will learn, if some other political leaders will emerge, those who really base the politics on ethics. This can give it a try. All the other variants, no. I mean, because the problem is, people, I mean, especially Russians, are talking about, transformations and post-dictatorial things, comparing Russia, I don't know, with Spain, for example, or with Italy, arguing, okay, there was no real strong denazification in Italy. And look, or let's talk about Spain. It was, the Pact of Moncloa, all these things, no real digging into the past, and look, here is the prosperous Spain. But the problem is that you cannot compare Russia with Italy or Spain or Austria whatsoever. Russia is the permanent member of the Security Council with enormous nuclear power and enormous ability to inflict damage on its neighbors. Therefore, the responsibility is 10 times high. And going back in time, in the 90s, the whole idea of responsibility of the nuclear country was just vanished from the Russian mind. It was the academician Sakharov who was the last person to make some statement about this. But it is clear that even the Chechen wars were full-time possible only because the Russia is under the nuclear umbrella. And this very idea of being under the nuclear umbrella is something that you will not feel really in the daily life, but of course it gives the population in general and the perpetrators and genocidaries in particularly, the feeling of impunity. What you can do with us, finally. What you can do with us, and how to crack this mindset. I think the only slightest possibility lies in the national question. Because the only thing that is really happening now, a lot of people with the different national identities, they are starting to distance themselves from Russians. I know examples of people who are switching into writing in their own native languages. I know the examples of people who are starting really to rediscover the history of colonial abuse against
people who are in Russia.
In Russia, outside Russia. This is the national minorities. Those who really have something to say here. These are the people who were treated the same way as Ukrainians did. An example, I mean, Chechens were the first victim of the Russian aggression. But the problem is that, again, the general Russian liberal grouping, I would say, still not yet ready to listen to them. If you will take a look on the general big assemblies of the Russian oppositions, my gosh, you will see that maybe one representative of the national minority are there, symbolically, and maybe a few women. But it will be white men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s discussing the future of this multinational country. How this can happen? I don't know. I don't know.
When you were talking about these minorities who are in Russia, I was wondering, how do you and other Russians that are now living abroad, how do you still get your hand on the pulse of Russian society, or how do you get information at all about what is happening inside Russia?
There are such things as Signal, WhatsApp, and some other encrypted messengers.
So you're talking about private communication with private people, which are your...
Private people who are in position of certain knowledge, let's say. I mean, okay, I'm a former journalist with the 15 years of experience. You know what the main instrument of the journalist is? His phone book.
And do you have some insight about how your interviews, because you're very outspoken, what we hear today, you have written, and it was published in several interviews in European and international press. Do you have insights about how this resonates within Russia, for those who bother to read them, of course?
Two different groups. I will not offer the numbers, but two different, very distinctive groups. First are the people who say, yeah, you speak for us. We are very happy, we are not able to do so, but we are very happy to do. Because of course those whose profession is writing, those who are there, under the military law, which prohibits to call war the war, yes, they are very quickly returning back to Aesopian language of the Soviet period and trying to adjust. So, okay, for them, this is the representation of them. And the second group, of course, says that it's easy to you. You're in a free country. You can do whatever you want. And these worlds are drifting apart. These worlds are drifting apart. And since my unfortunate prediction is that this war will last long, Russian resources are not exhausted, Russian psyche is not exhausted, these worlds will drift. And I can see the only chance exactly in these issues of the national languages and minorities, which can keep the things going, which can help to formulate some other vision, which can help us to learn the lesson of really living in a country where all the nations are equal. Because also, what is the big problem of cultural imperial mindset? The Russian culture poses as one of the, biggest world something. We are in dialogue with French. We are in dialogue with British, with Germans probably, Not sure about Austrians. But those neighbors, they're just something in between. Something what you observe when your plane goes to, I don't know, to Paris. And this feeling that this behemoth is too big and very not sensitive to what is going on, what our neighbors are about, how do they live, what do they live. When it all happened in February 24th, in the talks and in public statements, I all of a sudden realized how few things Russians in general know about Ukraine. Just a very few things. Even on a basic level, they do not know. I was lucky enough because I was somehow also forced in my life to learn something. But the obscurity and uneducatedness is just unbelievable. And the same people will be extremely elaborate about, I don't know, Italian culture whatsoever. To learn the lesson that we could and should be, maybe, not the great culture, but the good neighbor. And it doesn't mean that we should bring our, delivery of Pushkins everywhere. And I would say that the very role of cultural elites now is to say, stop. We are not defending ourselves anymore. We stand and face everything what Ukrainians or Europeans can say to us. It's the moment of truth. If it will arrive, we have a chance. If it will not, it will be a long-lasting story of North Korean style.
I will give in a moment the floor for questions, so get ready for that part. Not yet, though, because I want to address one more question, and it is about a phenomenon that you certainly are acquainted with, and it is what we call canceling Russian culture, and this is very much also promoted by Ukrainians. There is a famous decision by the Pan-Ukraine, where they say our members cannot sit not only on a panel with a Russian, regardless who this Russian is, could be you, no. We cannot even participate in festivals or forums where Russians participate. Do you think this is a just decision? Do you support this policy?
First of all these years I'm witnessing Russians discussing Ukrainian decisions. I'm sick of it. We are not in a position to do so. I can only say full support, full support, full support. Yes.
Thank you. The microphone, please. There's a question, and raise your hands for the next ones.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lebedev, I want to ask you one thing. It's, we are observing this situation and this discussion of so-called good Russians. Mainly I'm talking about refugees, but people in Moscow. And there is an interesting indicator, which I'm not sure that full of public knows. It's a figure of Katya Margolis, who sometimes is too emotional, maybe a bit too narcissistic, but she obviously touches the nerve. And sometimes we have feelings that Katya Margolis is becoming more important for good Russians than Mr. Putin, and attracting much more attention than other events of the world. To give you some background, it's an artist from Russia who lives in Venice, who is calling Russians to moral responsibility and repentance for what's going on, which is really annoying a lot of Russians. What is your take on this issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very, as you put it, it's a very good indicator. Because if to make the long story short, what she says, first of all, not only support by words, please donate to Ukrainian charities, and first and foremost to Ukrainian army. If you're anti-Putin, please do something about this, because those who are really anti-Putin, they are on the front line on the Ukrainian side. And this is a much of annoyment for the general liberal group. Words, yes, but involvement in the real things, no. And for me, and so, yeah, she became the symbol of the person who tries to, you know, how to put this? To make this ethical stand. And the reaction of others are all of a sudden question, and who are you? Whom you suppose yourself to be to have the right to ask these questions? Is the unfortunate indicator of extreme infantility of those people who are supposed to be really responsible in the situation. Instead of developing this agenda, all the power and all the energy goes into mocking her, into explaining why these issues are to be decided only by the, I don't know, saints or whatsoever. And very bad signal for the future of this community, unfortunately.
Please raise your hands if you have questions. Are there? Okay, I don't see a hand, but maybe it will come. Yeah, the picture that you painted in front of us is quite dark, it seems to me. Where do you see light? Examples of people's action, of your...
I think the real bravery maybe is not to invent the light which is not there. Not to ask for immediate solutions where there is no one. Okay, I can think maybe about the British in the summer of 1940. What are the light there? What are the light to be offered? It's only the question of hurricanes and their quantity. What are the light we can offer to Ukrainians? Equipment, delivery, support, patience. Because it's one important thing about Putin and his experience. He is master of waiting. He had seen presidents coming and going, a lot of them, crowds of them. He even overweighted Merkel. He will wait. He had this resource of time. He will wait until the moment when some existing solidarity with the NATO, Soviet Union, or European Union will be corroded. He will wait. And our value and our dignity is in outwaiting, the master of waiting. And the second thing of him, he is the perfect, salesman of fears. This is his training. He was taught to govern and rule people by fear. This is his professional background. And what he is doing, he, through his puppets, he's selling fears. The fear of the nuclear war is one of them. The fear of we will freeze Europe, we will starve the world, whatsoever. What we cannot do is to stop this. What we can do, not to buy this. Not to buy this fears he is selling. So, and this is maybe the small light and the small effort. And the big light will come, at least for Ukraine.
Yes, 2 questions there.
Sergei Sergeyevich, you're first of all one of the most prominent contemporary Russian writers. So my question to you is a question to the writer. First of all, first part of the question is that do I understand correctly that your books are still on sale in Russia and you can influence the Russian public in a way, whatever limited, we are talking about a country of 140 million. So what is the influence? Do you feel, or do you have any feedback in relation to your books. And in this regard, do you, in your plans, intend to write about the today's Russia? And do you intend to write in such a way so that it will be, your writing will be available to the Russian audience inside Russia, or you write it for the future Russia in a way? So, artistic question, if possible.
First of all, it's a very important feature and, let's say, bizarre feature of the current Russian life. The books of those who are even under the criminal charges still are available in the bookshops. So the censorship is in place, but the market are also playing some role. I don't think it will last forever, but in the moment, we have really very few examples of books really taken out of the bookshelves. The books of the prominent critics of Putin are on sale, like Ludmila Ulitskaya, she is there in the bookshops, no prohibition. So but this is an evidence of, the regime is trying not to alarm and engage people too much. They will deal with this a little bit later. So yes, my books are still there. You can still really go to the shop and buy this. But I will not publish any books in Russia since then. For two reasons. First of all, because I do not want to. Second, because the new book, which is now being edited, will not be published by any publisher due to the juridical reasons. Nobody will risk to take it. We made an assessment.
What is it about, if you want to?
It's about Russia's war against Ukraine. So I do not know how the Russian manuscript will be circulating. Probably it will be digital samizdat. Okay, this is the reality, and this is... I would be ashamed, actually, to know that my new book could be published in Russia now.
There's a question in the back and one here, left front. Oh, Cyril.
Is it on? Thank you for your presentation. My question is about cultural sphere. Imagine that the war is over. How do you think Russia should build its relationship with Ukraine in terms of all of these items which are in Tretyakov Gallery or Hermitage, which were stolen from Ukraine over the centuries? What is your opinion? Thank you.
I think I missed at least half of the question due to the sound effects.
When this war is over, how will be the connections Russia-Ukraine? How do you imagine them?
It will generally depend on Russia's ability to punish the war criminals first and foremost. It's Ukraine now who is developing the idea of the International Tribunal. Only the group of Russian professional lawyers supported this idea. I do not see any evidence of real political oppositional support. And without this, without the punishment of the generals, of the officers who gave the orders, what sort of relation we can talk about? I think that's the cornerstone, the only one possible. I would personally be very happy to see Mr. Putin given to this tribunal. I don't know if it will ever happen, because as the Serbian case shows, it can be personally dangerous for the person who gives the order. I mean, Serbian Prime Minister was assassinated quite soon after the Milosevic transfer to Hague. But my belief is that from the Ukrainian side, and most importantly from European side, the question of tribunal should be a red line. This is what all the demands should be focused on. Without the tribunal and without real punishment no lift of sanctions, no lift of anything, no business as usual, no connections re-established. Unfortunately, if the Russians cannot do it by themselves, you should force them.
Who is you?
You.
Okay. Two questions there, one question here for a long time waiting for the microphone. Here.
Thank you. You are probably aware that the Russian soul, in quotation marks, and the Russian nation is romanticized. Some even have a fetish talking about the Russian soul, the Russian nation, that it's more original, or where the West should be, and the West got off the track, off the rails. How does that, someone knowing much more about the Russian soul and probably all those Westerners who fetishize it, make you feel? And what do you describe as the Russian soul and all these appeals to Russian soul and Russian nation and Russian identity?
Oh. You know, in the first month after the full-scale invasion, the request from the cultural editors of European newspapers, magazines, to write something about the Russian soul was the most frequent one. It was absolutely bizarre situation when the invasion was going on, but what people were referring to, like trying to orientate themselves and put themselves into a situation, was the question of the Russian soul. I don't know anything about it. I think that the last really existing Russians have been spotted in 1917. All what we have after is the Soviet Russians. It's a different breed of people. It's a different breed of people. And personally, I can share one very personal experience. In 1999, I was 18 years old. I was supposed to go to the army, which definitely meant that I will end up fighting in Chechnya. Good luck, my parents divorced to protect me, so I get an exclusion. I was never in the army. The whole generation of people of the same age, they were avoiding the draft one way or another. In autumn and spring, when it's a draft campaign, we even been able to spot each other in Moscow underground by the certain accuracy of avoiding the police posts. But what I'm asking myself now, it was the Yeltsin's period, the political protest was possible. Why the hell on earth, we, the whole generation, never protested publicly against the war? We were very socially skilled to avoid, but to protest, to go into the open conflict with authority, never. This is about the Russian soul.
Sergei Sergeyevich, you are a writer, so let's talk about the language. I mean the language used on the social media in the Russian-speaking discussions. It's, in my opinion, very vulgar. It's a kind of convicts, zeks language, blatnoy, and you won't find this kind of language in public discussions in English or in German. So why intellectuals, people with high education, are using such a language?
Okay, I think I will answer with the reference to what I see on the Russian television, because sometimes I take this doses of radiation. You have the TV shows. You have the people who are supposed to be experts, military experts, whatsoever, but they are very cleverly picked to represent certain very common types, mostly of males, within the Russian society. They are really people from the crowd, and they are acting not as experts, but as a collective medium. And they're speaking the language which do not alienate the audience from them. It's really the simple matters. The simple language with obscenities whatsoever. And unfortunately, I think it makes this cause really sort of a people's cause. And it's not about the real opinions, it's not about analyzing the situation, it's about you know, cooking or preparing some half-digested emotions and then boiling them up to the point when, I don't know, Solovyov comes and says, we should burn them into ashes. It's a bit of a strange, dark, collective sessions, I don't know, mysterious or whatsoever. It's not about real cultural procedures or etiquette codes. It's about appealing to the very primordial, archaic things in us. And as I told you, when the whole country is going back in time, it also affects the language and the rules of use of language. We are arriving back into the real Gulag times when the early Soviet Stalinist culture was very much rough and tough. When you see the real archival documents from the 30s and from the 30s, when you understand how these prosecutors, judges, and NKVD officers spoke, they were illiterate. They were not able to write a line without a few mistakes. And then they ruled Russia. And we are arriving exactly in the same point. Because when you see the so-called parliamentarians in the so-called parliament, you are on what street they were found? Where is this street? And this makes this political culture really sellable. Because, Putin is much of the criminal. His experience in the 90s is not already the experience of the state security officer. His experience of the criminal. His acts as the so-called deputy of the mayor in St. Petersburg are the actions of criminal. He's very much in the criminal culture. His entourage is half from the criminal scene. So, and of course it inflicts and affects the whole narration, the whole language. He was the first to sell this, because even Yeltsin, with all his awful deeds, he was following the code of a Soviet bureaucrat. You cannot be too brutal or too rough. When with the famous phrase, we will find the terrorists in the toilet and we'll kill them there, Putin opened this gate.
Last question.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hello. I have a question, thank you so much for your speech. And I'm Indigenous North, and I'm really quite interested in the part that you were saying about the multinational Russia. So, and with these circumstances, you said that there's lots of nations turning to their native language, more using their native and mostly the focus on this. And my, let's say, personal question, or even your perspective, or even advice, how to kind of mitigate those tensions between the different layers of identities that those multinationals has, within Russia, within this, if there's any tension exists in the certain given circumstances, who I am in terms of, am I Russian first, or I'm first in my native language, native culture. So that's my question. Thank you.
The thing is that now, of course, in terms of numbers, Russia is quite a homogeneous state, because approximately 80% of its inhabitants consider themselves Russians. But when really the gates will be opened, the people with the double identities, for whom it's profitable now to count themselves as Russian, will start to shift. And the question of language, of native language, is always in this situation the question of historical violence and historical past. Because it's not only Ukraine which was deprived of its language throughout the Stalinist and then the Khrushchev and Brezhnev times. Every other nation under the Soviet rule, and then now under the Russian rule, suffers exactly this. In 2018, it was Putin who signed the law making the lessons of the national languages not obligatory. You can imagine what does it mean. It's the shift and sift of the national cultures. But at the same time, I can see that the Russian aggression, the Russian war, really rises in those Buryats or Kalmyks or Chechens or people of the north. Two simple questions. What we have to do with this is the Russian war. Because sometimes troops are transferred from Buryatia for 6,000–7,000 kilometers. How this can be. And of course, the second question is very practical. Where is my identity? And all the repressed memories, all the repressed things are slowly coming back to light. And this is you ask where the light is. I would say where the life is. The life is in you cannot erase certain things forever. They will fight back. And this is the moment where I see the first signs that these things are coming back. It will be very uncomfortable for the bearers of the Russian culture. And it's good. It should hurt.
Sergei Lebedev, thank you very much. A round of applause, please.